Hey guys, it's Pete Wright with PluggedInPhoto.com, and today we're here in Washington, D.C. with Nathaniel Dodson talking about time-lapse photography. Nathaniel just finished up a really great short film project called Philly is Ugly, so if you get a chance to check it out, go over to phillyisugly.com. There's some great behind-the-scenes footage, a little tutorial information there for some more in-depth looks. But today what we're going to talk about is if you're just getting started, you want to try time-lapse, the basic tools that you need, the basic things you need to know in terms of setup, and also the difference between time-lapse and hyperlapse when you're ready to take that next step. So Nathaniel, tell us a little bit about where we are today.
So we're here today and we're shooting a couple scenes for just a really super short film-ish kind of thing that we're going to shoot specifically for this video for you guys to check out as well. We got the Jefferson Memorial and the Washington Monument and even the Capitol building and this big body of water here, the basin or whatever they call it. Really, really nice looking stuff. We've got some great soft light, some good moving clouds, a lot of really great things to make an interesting time lapse.
Phenomenal.
So it should be a lot of fun. Yeah, absolutely. So we're gonna take a look at what's gonna take for you to jump in and shoot a time lapse or two or three or a dozen.
So when you're getting started, just some of the basics. Tell me the kind of tools that we need, the absolute essential tools in terms of camera, lenses, tripod, any tools that you need to trigger the camera, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's actually remarkably easy to go out and shoot a time lapse. There's not a ton of gear you need to go buy. You don't need any kind of ridiculously expensive motorized this or that or anything like that. You need a camera, a decent camera hopefully, a tripod, and what we call an intervalometer. And actually there are some DSLRs these days, DSLR cameras, that have built-in intervalometers, and that's really all you need. So a great camera, a great tripod, it's imperative that you have a great tripod, and a decent intervalometer, and you can go out and shoot time-lapse or hyperlapse or anything lapse with that equipment. So
and you've got an intervalometer here.
I do.
I've got the same one, it's the Shutter Boss by Velo. And I know when I got this one, I think I spent like $45–50, so you don't have to spend a lot of money on this stuff.
No, absolutely not. And it's quality. This is what I use to shoot Philly is Ugly. We're a couple of these guys, and yeah, they think they cost me $45 a piece. So for less than $100, I got two of them and ran two cameras while I was shooting the film, and it worked flawlessly. So it was great. And the intervalometer basically it takes over your camera. As far as you set the intervalometer and say, hey, every X number of seconds or minutes or hours even, I want to take one picture, and then I want to take this, I want to shoot this many frames, maybe 100, maybe 200, maybe 300 or more. You set it all up on the intervalometer. It's very intuitive to use, very easy, and then you press the start button and it just goes, and then when it gets to the end of that, it stops.
So when you're setting that,
yes,
talk to me about the number of frames you need in terms of from the edit standpoint. Once you get to the back end of this, how many frames should you have taken and how should you edit that in, those types of things?
So the important thing about a time-lapse film, and maybe the most difficult thing to wrap your mind around, is the idea of frames per second. And that's important because if you know how many frames per second you're shooting, you know how many frames you need to capture to get a certain number of seconds of footage. The film that I shot, I knew I wanted at least 24 frames per second. That's cinematic quality, widescreen video, 24 frames per second. When you start getting to 30 and 60 frames per second, yes, it's very smooth, but you start to have this almost cheap sitcom feel, and it's not that cinematic smoothness that you get with 24 frames per second. So think about it this way. If you want to shoot 10 seconds of time-lapse video, and you know you want 24 frames per second, multiply 24 by 10 seconds, 240 frames, you're going to have 10 seconds of finished footage. So that's basically what I would do, is say, okay, I know I want to shoot 10 seconds of footage of the Washington Monument, let's say. I would set my camera to take 240 frames, and I would let it go. Now, we can talk about it, the interval, which is the number of seconds in between shots. That really doesn't matter.
So it doesn't have to be 24 frames in 24 seconds.
No.
It could be 24 frames over an hour that combine into,
exactly.
Because once you get into editing, you're just making 24 frames equal 1 second of actual footage.
Exactly, right. So you're taking your 24 frames, you could shoot 24 frames in a day, right, over the course of 24 hours, and do that for a month. And then you're going to have 31 second chunks of footage, right, 24 frames each day. That's 1 second of 24 frame per second footage a day. Multiply it by 30, you would have 30 seconds of footage. Or you can take a shot every 2 seconds if you wanted, or every 1 second if you wanted.
Really, the sky's the limit in terms of how you do it. It just kind of depends on how much movement and change you want in the scene.
Exactly, precisely. And sometimes your shutter speed is going to dictate as well. If you're shooting at night and you have a 10-second shutter, obviously if the shutter's open for 10 seconds depending on the speed of your camera's buffer and the speed of your card, you need to allot probably 12 to 14 seconds of interval time for your intervalometer. So your camera has time for that 10-second exposure, and then a few seconds to write the image to the card and just get ready for the next shot, and then you're ready to go.
So let's talk a little bit about exposure. Is there any difference in exposing for a time-lapse than what you would do to expose for a regular photo? Because essentially what you're doing is just taking a series of individual photos and then putting them together. I know, I would think that the main thing you want to do is make sure that there's consistency from one shot to the next throughout the entire thing.
And this is a really, really great question, because there's some people that will shoot in aperture priority mode and let the camera dictate exposure. I don't do that. I don't like to do that. What happens when you end up compressing all the footage together is you get a lot of flicker in your final product. And there are a lot of anti-flicker tools out there. I steer clear of the aperture priority mode altogether. I like to shoot in pure manual mode. Again, one of the beautiful things about time-lapse, and one of the things that makes the most stunning time-lapses, is when you're capturing not only movement, let's say the movement of the water, or the movement we're getting in the clouds, but when you're capturing moving light, right? Light is the name of the game in photography in general. So capturing moving light. So I like to shoot in manual, but to answer your question about exposure more directly, it comes down to this. Longer exposures make your time-lapse appear to be more silky smooth and flowing, almost like you're pulling a silk drape around. Whereas if you shoot at a faster shutter speed, let's say 1,000th of a second, if there's enough daylight or light in general to shoot at 1,000th of a second, it's going to give your time-lapse more of kind of a stop motion effect. Then you add to that a tilt shift lens, let's say, for more advanced shooting, or there's even post-processed time-lapse blurs you can add to really get this sort of little miniature effect. So if Philly is ugly, I shot that with a combination. I mean, there's some clips of video in there that are 30-second exposures where I spent 2+ hours just to get 6 or 8 seconds of footage. Then there are others where I was shooting at 1,000th of a second. So a lot of times the light's going to dictate, but knowing that difference between, your clouds are going to appear blurry if you shoot with a longer exposure. The water here, one of these cameras is shooting at 1/4 of a second because I want to smooth out the surface of the water and just have light and color reflecting into the surface of water, right? So I took that into consideration, and I'm shooting at f32, not because I care about the depth of field, not because I necessarily even care about the sharpness, but because I want to be able to stop all the way down to 1/4 of a second so I can smooth out the water.
So talk to me a little bit about composition, because obviously when you're going through and you're setting up the perfect shot, composition and keeping in mind what you're seeing in the photo is important, or in the video is important. So talk to me about your goals in composition.
Well, yeah, so any video is a series of still images stacked together and just played all at once. So getting a perfect or a beautiful still photograph is the first step to getting beautiful video or a beautiful time-lapse or hyperlapse or any kind of anything. The still image is the foundation, it's the starting point. Get a great still shot, you're good. You get great exposure, good. And of course, composition is key. So yes, absolutely, when I'm framing something up, really it's the way I see the world. It's the way I'm looking at things. Do I want to get low with my camera and shoot up and make something appear majestic? Maybe with a wide-angle lens. Maybe I don't like the wide angle. Maybe I'm using a telephoto lens. And compositionally speaking, when it comes to time-lapse photography, using a telephoto lens can take a seemingly mundane scene or something that somebody sees all of the time. Let's say the Washington Monument. If we take a 200, 300, or 400 millimeter lens and zoom right in on the top of that monument and have beautiful moving clouds behind it, that's not a picture of Washington, D.C. that you see every day, even if you live here.
It's a new way of looking at it.
Exactly. So using a very long focal length is a great way to go ahead and create unique shots out of, commonplace scenes and even commonplace angles that seem cliche. So yeah, composition is very important. And then it's a matter of what do you like? Do you want to see a lot of water? Do you want to cut off the top of the building you're shooting? Do you want to cut the frame off at the edge, like here with the Jefferson Memorial, perfect example. I'm cutting just past the Jefferson Memorial. That's the edge of my frame because I don't want to see any of the city to the left side of the memorial here. I want it to almost look like the memorial is set in the woods, really, and everything around it is green. And we have all the city pushed off frame to the left. So that was the composition that I chose when it came to the Jefferson Memorial. And I'm using a prime 100mm lens that I'm shooting it on. So that's dictating kind of the zoom a little bit. And I like that. Creativity, limit me a little bit, that's great. A lot of great creative ideas are born when you're forced into certain limitations. So I'm absolutely okay with the prime lens.
So when you're doing this and you're pulling it all together, are there key things in terms of, hey, look, I need to make sure there's motion? I mean, obviously, if you're in a scene where there's nothing moving, then you almost won't even be able to tell it's a time lapse. So are you looking for certain skies on certain days? Are you looking for traffic and cars? Are there things like that that are really important for you to have some level of motion?
Absolutely. So a couple things. If I'm shooting time lapse, 85 to 90% of what I'm shooting is either at sunrise or sunset, because you are guaranteed of one thing, and that's rapidly changing light. You're always going to have some movement. So shooting at sunrise or sunset, vitally important. Then if you can find somewhere where you have movement, be it the clouds in the sky, if you've got a beautiful sky the day you're shooting, that's wonderful. If you can get your camera to the middle of a highway and set it down on the ground to get all those cars shooting by you, that's amazing. If you can shoot something, an overhead shot of an airport where every few seconds, as we have happening behind us here, we have jetliners taking off, and you can capture these, 3, 4, 5 seconds, or 3, 4, 5 frames, excuse me, where you can see the progress of this aircraft taking off. That's an amazingly cool picture to have. And when you crush that together in a video, very cool. There's motion everywhere. There's nowhere where there's not motion. Where there's life, there's motion. So you can always find motion, but the surefire way to get motion or see motion in your time-lapse film, shoot at sunrise, shoot at sunset. You've got that hour and a half of just incredibly fast-moving light, and just think about it. When you see a shadow start at one side of a sidewalk or a plaza, and over the course of 10 seconds that shadow elongates to the point where it's stretching all the way across the plaza in stunning 4K video or 1080p HD, and it's beautifully smooth, and you get these stunning tones, that is such a cool thing to look at. And that's something you just never see in real life, because it's not how you see the world. But we've sped it up, courtesy of time-lapse.
So I know we've talked a lot about just basic time-lapse and kind of getting started. I want to touch just a little bit on hyperlapse, because time-lapse has taken off so quickly that a lot of people have kind of mastered it and said, what's the next evolution? And I guess hyperlapse is that next thing. And I know there's different ways of doing hyperlapse, and a lot of people are saying, man, I want to do hyperlapse, but I'm seeing all this really, really expensive gear, and I'm just learning how to do time-lapse. So I want to talk a little bit about, hey, once you've experienced that, first of all, what's the difference between the two? And secondly, once you've kind of experienced time-lapse, how can you experiment and get started in hyperlapse?
Absolutely. And hyperlapse, also, you can think of it, it's something called walk lapse as well. Same kind of thing. Walk lapse is sort of the less expensive hyperlapse, if you will. But either way, two good search terms if you're going to do research on your own when it comes to what hyperlapse is. But simply put, hyperlapse is super cool. Take the words dolly, gyroscope, slider, boom, kick them out of your vocabulary. You don't need that stuff to get started with it. Sure, if you want to do that later on, great. But remember, a great photograph, a great video is not about the tools you use, but what you capture, what you see with your eye. You can get great hyperlapse footage without these expensive tools. So let's talk about what hyperlapse is, right? So hyperlapse is, it's very difficult to explain what exactly it is. You have to see it to understand. It's like the first time you watch HD television. It's incredible. It's like shooting a time lapse while the camera is moving, while the camera is being moved. So you feel like you're flying through high definition 3D space very quickly in full 4K, 1080p HD, just stunning color and tones and all the incredible capabilities of these DSLRs that we're shooting these time lapses on even today. So the way you can shoot a hyperlapse or a walk lapse, or I'm just going to refer to it as hyperlapse, the way you can shoot a hyperlapse is you need to, in between each frame, if you can hear the cameras back here clicking every 6 seconds or taking a photograph. If I wanted to convert a hyperlapse, where let's say it made it look like I was spinning around the Jefferson Memorial here, I would need to take my tripod in between each shot and move it just a little bit, maybe 8 inches, maybe 12 inches, whatever I wanted to do, however quickly you want your hyperlapse to move. The slower a hyperlapse is moving, the smoother it's going to be, and the slower zooming and panning is in general, typically the more cinematic it is.
So now, a question with that, when you're doing your hyperlapses, composition was a big deal with time-lapse, but I'd imagine it's a little bit more different with composition with Hyperlapse in terms of the size and placement of things, foreground and stuff like that. So tell me a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So you can hear this afternoon we're combating some airplanes from the local airport, and that's a perfect example of how some of these hyperlapses work. The further away from an object you are in a hyperlapse, the less it's going to look like it's moving. But the cool thing about hyperlapse is that movement. So you want to get close to objects that you're shooting. Foreground is incredibly important. If you have a hyperlapse where the camera is sliding out from behind a tree or rising out of these rocks, really cool stuff, really super cool stuff. The further away you are from any given object, you have to move much more for it to look like you're really floating through space. Otherwise, it just looks like the same picture at a very slightly different angle. You don't have this same very dramatic, very rapid change that you normally would have if you grab a camera and shoot a time-lapse while you're walking through a park down a pathway, let's say, or something like that. So foreground, I can't stress it enough. If you're shooting a skyline from across a river, it's not going to be nearly as cool as if you go into that city and you shoot that hyperlapse much closer.
So are there any tools that you can use that might make it a little smoother in terms of the movement? Because I know the idea of picking up a camera and placing it and, oh, I just messed up my composition. Are there tools that you might recommend that somebody could just go to the hardware store and buy?
Absolutely. So remember, gyroscope, we don't know what that is. Dolly, we don't know what that is. Rails, what are rails? Ridiculously expensive is what rails are, and difficult to bring to a public place and lay down 30 feet of rails. Not at all feasible on your budget, on my budget, on most people's budget. And if you're just a one-man operation, you can't go out and set up all that elaborate infrastructure. So here's what you can do. You can always move your tripod by hand, but a really quick and easy and a great tool and a great sort of hack is go out to your hardware store, go out to any of these big box stores, buy yourself some balloon tires or buy a wagon with balloon tires maybe, and put your tripod in that. You now have a dolly, if you will, that you can pull along. So the camera will take a shot, you'll drag the cart 8 inches, 12 inches. Camera's going to take another shot. You can keep an eye on composition, peer through your viewfinder, make sure that you're not losing anything that you absolutely want to be in your shots. And you have a nice dolly, and you don't need to worry about those big balloon tires. You want, by the way, you want balloon tires, not hard rubber, caster tires, or wheels, I should say, anything like that, because that's going to be, it's going to move the tripod and jostle everything everywhere. Balloon tires are going to be a much smoother ride, and remember, you don't need to worry about little bumps and dings along the way, because you're shooting, your camera's going to take the shot when the dolly comes to a standstill. So all that movement that happens when you drag the wagon, who cares? Because you take the photograph when the wagon actually stops. Camera takes a shot, you drag the wagon a little further, camera takes another shot, and you wash, rinse, and repeat 300 times if need be.
And my experience is anytime you're trying something new, the more measured you can be in it, the more successful you're going to be, especially the first time you try it. So am I right in assuming that if the first time you try this, you find something to help measure off the increments, or even if you go and mark off and say, okay, I'm going to move 8 inches or a foot, and I've marked off 100 shots at a foot each, so after every shot I'm just going to move a foot. If it's pre-measured, that it's a little bit more exact, that you're going to have a better level of success?
In most cases, sure. Now, with anything photographic, with anything creative, don't be too measured, because you need to always allow room for creativity. But there is a lot of weight to that. And kind of, again, you don't need to go out with a tape measure and chalk and start marking off 12 inches 300 times down a walkway. A really cool thing to do, and a lot of modern cities have brick sidewalks, stone sidewalks, cobblestone, something where you can find a line that's already down in the ground, dig in those front wheels of your dolly wagon, or your tripod, right, your two front legs of the tripod, dig them into that grout line, and just follow that around with the camera. So you got your 2 tripod legs in that grout line, and you say, okay, I'm going to move 5 brick lengths every shot. So you drag it over 5 brick lengths, camera's going to take a shot, 5 brick lengths, over and over and over and over again until you get the hyperlapse of scene that you want.
So when you're doing that, and maybe this isn't the best question, but when you're making that move, let's say you've got something like we've got the Washington Monument off to our right here. As you're moving, do you keep the camera centered on the Washington Monument, or do you just keep it centered on the entire scene with the understanding that everything's moving, including the Washington Monument? I'd imagine it'd be very hard to keep the Washington Monument centered as you're moving.
You can actually do either. So you can create something where you say, look, I want the camera to be very location-centric, not yeah, location-centric, not monument-centric, we'll say in this case for the Washington Monument. So location-centric would mean I'm just floating through space. I don't care about where the positioning of anything is. This is just me flying through space in this time lapse, in this hyperlapse, because we're just flying through space. Everything's moving so quickly, traffic and clouds and the water and everything. Now, if you did want to do something where it looked like maybe you were swinging around a monument, there's a lot of great hyperlapses where you see, you know, the Eiffel Tower, the Empire State Building. You know, people drive. You drive around like the CN Tower and do this hyperlapse where you're spinning around the CN Tower over the course of a minute. Maybe you're spinning around it multiple times. And all you're going to do, and again, a quick trick is your focusing dots in your viewfinder. Check out the viewfinder and keep those focusing dots. In the case of the Washington Monument, I would keep my straight up and down focusing dots, whatever, 5, 10 dots right in a row. I keep them, boom, right there in the center cut, right through the middle of the Washington Monument.
So you use the tools you have.
Exactly, right. And then you're just going to drag your dolly. So you drag your dolly, move into place. Check out the viewfinder. If you need to adjust the dolly, you're quickly getting back and you're checking it out. If you need to increase your interval, let's say instead of a 6-second interval, you want to give yourself a 12 or an 18-second interval to give yourself extra seconds to prep each shot, do it. Spend an hour to get 10 seconds of footage. It's going to be worth it in the end. It's going to be worth it in the end if you get it right in camera, because if you don't get a smooth-ish sort of shot in camera, it's going to be very, very hard to smooth out later. Now, there are a lot of post-production techniques to smooth stuff out, and a lot of stabilization tools, which you always need to use anyway, but if you don't at least do a reasonable job in camera, it's going to be very, very difficult to get anything that's even remotely usable as a final product.
So, kind of going back to time-lapse, behind us, we're actually shooting a couple of different time-lapses. You've got 2 cameras set up, and I'd love to have an explanation of why it is that you're shooting 2 different scenes at one time, just so that it makes a little bit more sense in terms of why you would set up 2 cameras.
Okay, well, it's easy for me to carry 2 cameras. I can load everything I need for one shot into a backpack. So I've got 2 tripods in my hands, 1 camera on each, and a backpack on my back. That's how I'm traveling around when I'm shooting these time lapses. So it's easy to do, and you've got twice the camera power. You've got twice the images. You've got twice the scenes, because you're not even photographing, the same thing. We're taking a shot on this angle of the Washington Monument here, and we're taking a shot this angle of the Jefferson Memorial. And also, maybe more importantly, not only are we getting multiple angles of the same location, or even really different locations, we're in the same location physically, but we're photographing 2 different locations. More importantly, you can shoot the same location at 2 different focal lengths. Something very zoomed in, so you're creating a very interesting look at maybe a very not interesting thing, or a very common thing. And then you can also get a very wide-angle sweeping shot of that same thing. So you can get something that takes in the entire scene, and then something that focuses on a detail. That's fun to play with in editing. It's fun to use all over the place. So yeah, you got twice the cameras, twice the power, twice the options in post-production, and you're able, with 2 cameras from the same location with different lenses, you're able to capture a vastly different looking scene. So it can be very, very useful.
Fantastic. I think that's great information. Is there anything else that you would think is important to know in terms of just the capturing portion that we haven't talked about today?
Not really. Have fun with it. Don't overthink it. Whether you're using a 4-second interval on your intervalometer or a 12-second interval, does it make a difference? Yes. Is it something you need to worry about? No. Are you going to get a better time lapse at a 4-second interval than a 12-second interval? If you're focusing on that and not what you're shooting, you're going to get a worse time lapse with either one of them. Pick one and roll with it. I went with a 6-second interval because I knew mathematically over the course of 30 minutes I would get 12.5 seconds of footage. The vast majority of the Philly is Ugly time lapse is shot at 1 image every 6 seconds, I should say. That rule was broken when I was shooting some of the night shots where I had to shoot, a 10-second exposure or longer exposures. So don't overthink it. It's not that difficult. Leave room for creativity. That's the name of the game. Have fun with it. Don't worry about it. Trust the process, really, more than anything. If you're out in the field, you're not getting great shots, trust the process. When you get home and check it out, you're going to have great stuff going. Also, maybe a very, very important thing, manual focus and custom white balance. By playing with custom white balance, adding blue to the scene at night, you're going to get great sunrise or sunsets in the very early morning, very late evening. Or by cranking up the warmth in the same exact situation, you can add a little bit of this fiery nature and this cool cinematic coloring to the stuff you're shooting. So custom white balance and manual focus are also really, really important things, and just kind of little nice things to know.
Yeah, are there certain settings that they need to have the cameras on?
Absolutely not. The shutter speed is dependent on your light and the motion you want to capture. Do you want those cars on the highway to look like those cool blurred streaks of light, or do you want them to look like little individual cars moving around? Both really cool. It all depends on what you want.
So you see, we've been actually shooting time lapses the entire time we've been doing this tutorial today of the interview. And what we're going to do is actually have Nathaniel, once he gets back home, sit down on his computer and record his computer so that you can see the software into things. We want you to actually see all the little steps that he takes in terms of combining them to get the finished product, and then you'll actually get to see the film. Later on tonight, he's actually going to hit a few other spots in DC, so you'll get to see some really, really cool films he's putting together. And if you get a chance, I really encourage you guys to go to his website and check out his photography. It's Endy Photography, E-N-D-Y, photo.com, ENDYphoto.com. His photography's phenomenal. And also check out phillyisugly.com. That's that 5-minute film that we talked about early on. It's absolutely stunning time-lapse photography. Nathaniel, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the time.
Beautiful, beautiful work. And hopefully you guys will come back and check us out at pluggedinphoto.com. Thanks a lot.